Know anyone who uses knives to get bread out of a toaster? I cringe at the thought. Here's a simple gift idea that can be used for toast, salad, and so much more. You'll need 2 thin strips of hardwood like maple. I'm going to round over the tips, but you can cut them on an angle or however you like. After tracing a semicircle, I'll simply shape them using a sander. Next, I'll need a small block to connect these 2 pieces. I have this piece of maple, but I only need a very small block, so I'll first cut off a little piece. By the way, the exact dimensions for this build can be found in the written article on my website. I'll leave a link down below. The key to making kitchen tongs is to add a small angle to the connector so that they stay open at rest, but can be flexed closed. I recommend going with an angle of 87.5 degrees, so just 2.5 degrees off a square 90. Balancing this angle finder on the cube is probably the most challenging part of this whole thing. Okay, so as you can see, my 2 lines taper in towards each other, so I've got a wide end and a narrow end. Instead of trying to cut this with a saw, I'm going to just sand it down up to the lines that I traced. It's easy to accidentally round the corners if you're using this method, so I'll check for flatness and then finish sanding on a flat surface just to make sure the faces are nice and flat. I can now glue the parts together, and because this will be used in the kitchen and get washed, I'm using type 3 waterproof glue. Now I should have known better, but I didn't anticipate this would happen. So to help keep everything in its place, I grabbed these micro clamps that I found at Princess Auto. They come in really handy. And with that, I can clamp it up and let it dry. While that dried, I went through my lumber cart to find a thin strip of walnut that would contrast nicely with the maple. The idea is to add a few splines, both to strengthen the joint and to add a nice visual detail as well. To help cut the splines, I'll use this block of wood. I need to cut it to the same angle as my tongs, which I'll do with the help of my miter gauge. I'll just adjust the angle so it's off center by 2.5 degrees, just like we did for the small block earlier. I can then lock that in and make the cut. I'll double check to confirm that we have the 87.5 degrees that we're looking for, and yep, all good. Okay, I'm now going to use the block to help push the tongs through the blade. But first, we need to set the blade height so that it's just a tad lower than the strip of walnut I'll be using for the splines. Alright, I'll hold the tongs up against my block of wood and push it all the way through. In fact, I probably should have started by pushing the block through on its own first. Oh well. Without touching the fence, I'll flip the tongs over to cut a symmetrical groove on the opposite side. Then, finally, adjust the fence and cut a final groove down the middle. Next, I'll cut a few splines and then apply a generous amount of glue to both the groove and the splines, making sure to push them all the way down until they bottom out. Once dry, I'll use a flush trim saw to shave off the excess. I like to use a little tape to help protect the surrounding area from being gouged by the teeth. Last but not least, and this is probably the most satisfying step, is to sand the handle smooth. I'm also going to round over the top to give it a more refined look. A final hand sanding, and then I'll apply some Total Boat Wood Honey as a food safe finish. This little gift is a really easy one to make. Plus, it's suitable for both little kids and big kids too. And by that, I mean adults. just in case that wasn't clear. I need to cut 27 identical cubes. The key is to first cut strips that match the thickness of your wood. I'm using cherry wood that's just under an inch thick, but you can use whatever size you want really. You can use calipers to check the thickness, or a simple trick is to just cut a strip and compare it to your blank. If you flip it on its side and the thickness is the same, you've nailed it. Once I finish cutting the strips, I'll grab my small parts crosscut sled. I made a video on how to build this a few years ago, and I'll link that up in the top right corner. Again, aiming to get perfect cubes here, I'll use one of the strips to set my stop block. Before I cut my cubes though, I'll first trim off the end of the strip to make sure it's perfectly square. Now I can start cutting the cubes. I'll stop after the first few to check that the dimensions are identical on all sides. Just flip them over randomly and feel the tops with your fingers. If they're not all perfectly flat, I'll need to adjust my stop block, but luckily everything feels perfect. So with that, I'll proceed to cut all 27 cubes. Now comes the fun part we all love, right? Okay, I'm not going crazy here, just a light sanding on all sides and breaking the edges slightly so they won't splinter later on. I'm setting up a couple stops at 90 degrees to use as a reference during the glue up. I didn't invent this puzzle, by the way. It's called the Soma Cube, and there are several variations if you want to Google it and learn more about it. The idea is to glue up 7 specific parts, and I'll show you what those are in just a minute. Now you may be inclined to match up the grain orientation so it looks really nice, but don't. You actually want to glue them up in random order so it won't be as easy to see the patterns once the cube is assembled. The tricky part is gauging how much glue to use. Too little and it won't hold up for very long. Too much and you'll get squeeze out, which I really don't want to deal with. I used some painter's tape to apply pressure and keep the cubes aligned while they dried. Once I had a good sense of how much glue to apply, I had my 7 pieces assembled in no time. Alright, all dry now and we can unwrap them. When all is said and done, you should have 7 pieces that look exactly like these. For the record, I have no idea how to assemble this Soma cube, but I couldn't resist trying to figure it out. Maybe it was just luck, but I got it on the second try. Or maybe I'm a genius. The jury's still out on that one. I was certainly proud of myself though, that much is clear. If you do want to know the solution, although I think there's more than one, here it is. As a finish, I'm using Total Boat Wood Honey. In fact, you'll notice that I use this finish on every gift in this video. It's awesome for finishing small products because it's food safe, has no VOCs, and it's super easy to apply. Just flood the surface, then wipe it off after 20 minutes. That's it. It gives the wood a really warm, rich finish. And by the way, you can get 5% off all Total Boat products by using the link in the description below. As a bonus, I decided to make a box to hold the Soma cube using my laser cutter. I just recently upgraded to this new CO2 laser. This is the X-Tool P2, and I'll be doing a full video on it in January if you're curious to understand why I went from questioning why I even got a laser in the first place to upgrading to this new, bigger, more powerful laser. In the meantime, X-Tool is running a Black Friday sale right now, and you can snag some sweet deals until November 24th. You may be thinking you've seen these 1,000 times, but this phone dock design is different and really caught my eye. All you need is 4 thin pieces of wood. I'm going to dress these pieces of maple up a little bit by adding a strip of walnut down the middle on 2 of the pieces. This is totally optional, but I think it'll look better. I'll rip the pieces into 3 strips, then discard the middle strip and replace it with the walnut. I won't be using clamps for this delicate glue up. These thin panels are very likely not to stay flat under the pressure of clamps, so instead I'll just use glue and tape. I'll first tape one side, then flip it over and apply a bead of glue to each seam. Then apply a few more strips of tape to keep the joints tight while they dry. Once dry, I'll clean off any dried glue with some 80 grit sandpaper. Then head back to the table saw. I'm going to cut mitered joints to make a cube out of these 4 panels, so I'll tilt my blade all the way over to 45 degrees. I've made some markings for my cuts that you can see here, so I can simply align the blade visually. The trick to getting 4 even-sized panels is to cut one side off all 4 panels first, then adjust your fence and cut off the other side from all 4 panels. It's time for the second glue up, and I'll use a very similar process to glue up this cube. I'll first apply tape to the back of each joint and lay them flat on the workbench. I can then apply glue to the joints and roll it up into a box. Yes, I'm using my pinky finger, but feel free to use a glue brush if that bothers you. After gluing up the final joint, I'll tightly seal it with some more tape, making sure the joints stay lined up and don't shift around. Once dry, I decided to ever slightly bevel all of the edges using a 45-degree bevel bit in my router table. Again, totally optional, but I think it'll give it a more polished look. Okay, now that I have my box, the last step is to shape it. For this, I'll use my miter gauge and add a simple sacrificial board to support the workpiece through the cut and limit tear out. I'll set my blade to 33 degrees and cut off both ends to create a trapezoid shape. As you can see, I've roughly traced out what I want it to look like so that I can just visually align the cuts. For safety, I'll make the first cut on this side of the blade, then move my miter gauge over to the opposite side and make the second cut. I now need to cut the slot that'll hold the phone. So I'll lower my blade, again just eyeballing it, looking to get the teeth to hit the top of my markings. And it looks like I nailed it. Next, I'll just move it over slightly and repeat to widen the slot until my phone fits. Oh, and you might want to consider adding some tape here to limit tear out. You'll probably notice that the bottom of the slots have jagged teeth marks, so I'll need to take care of those. I cut a scrap piece of wood to match the same 33-degree angle, and I'll use this as a sanding block to help smooth those ridges with some 80 grit sandpaper. All that's left is to apply a finish. Since I had the wood honey out, I just went with that. It's easy and fast, and once dry, the results look amazing. I don't actually know what these are called, but I recently purchased these large wooden fork-like things without any handles, and I wanted to see if I could replicate them. Doing some online research, I noticed a lot of them were branded as bear claw salad servers, so that's what I'm going with. I used the ones I bought to trace out these printable templates, and you can grab them for free on my website. I'll start by cutting out the template and using some spray adhesive to stick down the edge profile first. I like to use a plastic squeegee to help seal the bond. I'll let it dry for a few minutes, then use my bandsaw to start shaping the profile. I always joke that I'm terrible with the bandsaw, even though it's true, but I find that it helps to make relief cuts even if the curves aren't that sharp. Despite my best efforts, the result is choppy and far from smooth, but not to worry, it can all be fixed. Now that I have the rough profiles cut, I'm going to use my spindle sander to try to smooth them down. You can use an orbital sander instead, but of course a spindle sander makes it much easier. At this point, it doesn't have to be perfect. My goal is mainly just to have a flat, smooth surface to stick down the second template. Now that it's nice and smooth, I'll use some more spray adhesive to stick down the claw template on both pieces, again using a squeegee to help it bond. Before heading back to the bandsaw, I figured it'll be easier to make the rounded shape within each claw by drilling a hole with a large drill bit. Back at the bandsaw now, I can simply cut along the lines to shape the claw. As you can see, they don't look so great. Yet. As Steve Ramsey once said, this project is all about the sanding. So back to the spindle sander I go to slowly refine and shape these claws. All this sanding is actually kind of therapeutic. If you think the sanding stops there, think again. I finished sanding everything by hand up to 120 grit and then decided it was good enough. I'm using Total Boat wood honey to finish these salad servers. Just wipe on a heavy coat, let it sit for 20 minutes, and wipe it off. It's that easy and totally food safe. And it gives this cherry wood a nice warm glow. Next up, this one makes a great gift for young kids. If you're not familiar with Canadian money, here's a quick rundown. We have our penny with the maple leaf, a nickel with a beaver, a dime, our quarter with a moose, and then we have a dollar known as a loonie since it features a loon. And finally we have the toonie, which is our $2 coin. Not sure if you can see, but this one features a polar bear. What can I say? We love our animals. Now, we actually don't use pennies anymore, so let's get rid of that. So the largest coin being the toonie, I'll need to make sure that the openings are big enough to fit that coin. I'm making this piggy bank out of 4 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. You can make it out of solid wood, but this just seems easier. The coin bank is going to be in the shape of a house, and the coins will be inserted down the chimney. These are the templates that I've designed, and you can grab them for free on my website. I'll leave a link down below. One is for the outside of the house, and the other is for the inside where the coins will go. The first step is to glue together 2 panels. These will be the 2 inner layers. After spreading around the glue in a thin, even layer, I'll clamp it down and let it dry. Once dry, I'll grab the inner template and use some light spray adhesive to stick it down with the help of a plastic spreader. I get these at Princess Auto in the automotive section. You want to start the cut by going down the chimney. The blade's entry and exit point will actually become the coin slot. I'll then follow the inner line and come back out in the same spot. I can then remove the template and give everything a light sanding since I won't have access to the inside later on. Okay, now I'm going to add the two outer pieces of plywood. Again, applying a thin layer of glue to the entire surface. Then I'll flip it over and do the same thing on the opposite side. And add a bunch of clamps and let it dry. Once dry, I can stick down the second template, the one for the outside of the house. Just be mindful to align the chimney with the slot. A little more spray adhesive and I'll let that dry for a couple minutes. Again, you can download these printable templates for free on my website. Back at the bandsaw now, I'll use my fence to help make these cuts and keep them dead straight. Then finish off by freehanding the roofline. How cute is that? Now I want to keep the cut plywood edges exposed as a feature. I really like the look of plywood, but it can be frustrating when unexpected voids show up. I can practically see into the piggy bank here. To fix this, I'll use some DAP Wood Pro wood filler. Its natural wood color will blend perfectly with this plywood. I'll let it dry for a couple hours, then simply sand everything down. And just like that, the voids are all gone. We don't need this template anymore, so I'll just peel it off. But easier said than done. I'll just sand it off. And give the entire thing a good sanding while I'm at it. There's a key element we haven't addressed. Money goes in here, but I need a way to get it out. I found this cork plug that should be perfect. I'll start by creating a shallow recess using a large Forstner bit. Then switch up the bit and drill all the way through with a bit that's just a hair smaller than my cork. And there we go, it's now an official coin bank. I decided to hand paint the house's front with the help of some masking tape. I used some basic acrylic crafts paint that you can find at any craft store. If you do make this gift for someone this year, I recommend including a small contribution. Hey, I hope this video helped to get you inspired and maybe even spark some other gift ideas. I've got a bunch of other gift making videos just like this one that you can watch here. Until next time, thanks for watching, happy holidays, and see you soon.